marinate, and then I will sit down and do a draft, and then just go back and keep massaging it and massaging it.
Thank you for sharing a bit of your process. I want to turn it over to those in the room. If you have questions, please come on up to the microphone.
Thank you for that. I would like to ask because a big thesis in your sermon was about our willingness as participants to yield, whether that's as singers or ushers or the person delivering the sermon. And can you talk about that discernment about how to yield? Because it's one thing to know, okay, it feels like the time to yield, but what does that actually mean in terms of like my behavior?
That's good. This may be an oversimplistic answer, so I'm going to give an answer and give an anecdote. It's discernment. I mean, when you are in worship leadership, you are always listening with two ears. You have to listen to what's happening in the room, and you have to listen to what God is saying, right? And it's a practice, it's a discipline. And so you just have to discern. And so I can't say, well, when this happens, step to the left. You know, when this happens, step to the right, right? Because it all depends on where you are, what the space is, who's around, those kinds of things. Anecdote, Dr. James Abington, many years ago, came and did a workshop at our church. And he said on Saturday, sometimes God will show up and the preacher won't even have to preach because the word goes forth in song so powerfully that is the sermon. The word has gone forth. That was Saturday. Sunday we came to church. Usual order of service, song before the sermon. Choir sang. And then the choir just kind of slid into another song. Not unusual to hear two songs, but if you are a person that is sensitive to the Spirit, and depending on your tradition, this is the language in my tradition, you felt the Spirit locked down. And people went, okay, something's happening. And the choir had a song, and they couldn't let it go. And the choir had a song. And we're watching Pastor like, okay. And he's sitting there, and he went like this. He sat back. And the choir sang for 20 minutes. And when he got, and at this point in the service, like the lights are down. And so he would turn up the lights and then preach. And when it finally tempered down and people were shouting, praising God here, he said the doors of the church are open.
Wow.
And so he modeled, you know, that sermon's going to have to wait. You know, we do lectionary, so another 3 years when that text comes back up again. So, right? And so it's discernment. And so it's a discipline that you just have to be willing to allow God to tutor you in. It's the best I got. Bishop?
Well, I have two. The first question has to do with your first of all, your sermon was masterful, and I was lifted by hearing you preach it. I want to ask of this. While with all the attention, the meticulous, detailed attention given in the text to how the temple is to be constructed, I understand the necessary critique of our over-attention on vestments and garb and accoutrements to the sanctuary. But what place does that have in producing the glory?
Amen.
Second question. As a Pentecostal, I'm interested in phenomenology. So what does phenomenologically, what might the glory phenomenologically look like in the contexts in which you are familiar and perhaps in a broader, more ubiquitous way?
Sure. Okay, first question, what do all of these things, the vestments, the things happen? I mean, there's all kinds of history, and Bishop, you know some of this history. When we think of vestments, right? Early Christians didn't wear vestments. You know, it was post-Constantine, and the Christians said, man, the emperors have on cool dresses. Why don't we get some, right? And this is how the church began to adopt vestments, right? It's not this deep spiritual thing, but what happens is we adopt a practice, and sometimes we develop a theology around it. And so vestments over time have come to represent, or some traditions understand vestments as a sign of uniformity, but also as a sign of this, I am cloaking myself in something so that, when I come in the pulpit, people are like, oh, Pastor's got on a brand new purple shirt, girl, right? And it's because it's not about clothes, right? It is to deflect and take away attention. If we think about stained glass windows, people have opinions about them. If we think about the early church, and stained glass windows were pedagogical instruments. They attended to the lack of literacy, and so Bible stories were told in the stained glass windows. Now, some people will say, they'll go to a church and say, well, this church don't have any stained glass windows, it's all clear. They don't know theology, they don't know history. No, because my pastor made an intentional choice to have stained glass windows because he says, I want my people to see God act in nature. And so when we think about architecture, sacred space, we have to think about all of the intentions that a piece could have. And I always tell my students there's four: theological, cultural, aesthetic, and practical. Those are always considerations when you walk into sacred space, and sometimes they intersect. Sometimes they intersect. Like we have carpets on the floor. Like, why do we have carpets? Pastor was intentional. He said, no. He said, I'll go in a black church. He said, sometimes I want to remind us of the ancestors who didn't have instrumentation. And that was it. So we have to think about how we can interpret space theologically and not let Western paradigms tell us we're theological or not. So that's number one. Second question about the phenomenology. What does it look like? It could look very different. We were just having a conversation yesterday with someone about how the Spirit shows up. And so my cousin comes from Pentecostal background, and so when she sees me sitting, she just thinks that I'm just asleep or I don't have the Holy Ghost or something, right? And what I explain to people is we respond phenomenologically to the Spirit in ways as unique as our fingerprint, right? I'm not gonna get up and run. That's just not me. But I will sit there and cry. Like tears will just fall, and I will just, this is where you'll find me, right? And this could mean more than somebody running around because they just want people to see they got a new suit, right? Right, and so phenomenologically, it could look like running. It could look like speaking in tongues. It could look like waving your hands. It could look like sitting and tears. It looks different. There's not one way that it looks, I don't think. You may have a different answer, Bishop, but okay. Thank you.
My question is kind of basic, but how do you prepare for spaces that aren't your tradition? When you go into them to preach, how do you prepare? Because sometimes it's hard to find that balance between meeting what they need you to meet, but also being true to yourself.
That's a good question. Thank you for that. It's interesting. For example, I'll use my Calvin experience, right? Reformed Church, see, my friends know. And so I was given an assignment one day, and it came in literally it was a three-part sermon, like I preached and sang, and so I was trying to comport as not to scare my siblings, and so I wrote what I wrote, right? And so again, there's always this vertical dialogue. And so, and as a matter of fact, it was Dr. Abington. He was like, oh, she's being a good Episcopalian, check, right? And so, the second one, he's like, oh, she's being a good Episcopalian. And by the third time, because even when I was writing it, I was like, ooh, I'm like, I can't scare the people. And so by the time I got to that third person, he said, there's the Baptist, right? Sometimes you can't always do it, but the people who invite you don't invite you because of who they want you to be. They invite you because of who you are. So you don't have to wrestle with comportment, right? You don't have to do that. They invite you because they've seen who you are. They've seen what you do. And oftentimes, people will invite you because they're trying to stretch and grow their people. not just from a content perspective, but from a diversity of voices, a diversity of embodiment, right? And so you don't have to shrink who you are for the assignment.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you for everything for these past 2 days.
Amen.
Um, I have this thing where I talk a lot, and I'm wondering I heard you talk about how you listen for the voice of God, and then you started talking about your process. How do you know or distinguish between when you know that God is speaking and then when you start, and like how do you know this give and flow of God's voice and your voice?
That's a good question. First of all, God works with everyone as uniquely as their fingerprint, right? There's a way that I know that God speaks. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to wrest from you, if I may, is this notion that God's a dictaphone and you're just writing word for word. God has given you gifts, and God has created you in such a way that you craft language in a particular way. I craft language in a particular way because that's a gift that God has given me. God will give me the concept. It is mine to use the gifts and put the words together to write it, right? I still have to write the words. I still have to think. It is the inspiration, it's the vision. God will lift an idea from the page, and I'm like, oh, let me write this down. Let me get this. It's not that God is saying, and then put a period here, comma here, and no, not that verb, this verb, right? God gives you the concept, but it is still the gifts that God has given you to execute. That's why if we understood ministry more as the collaborative partnership into which God has invited us, as opposed to God calling us and giving us orders like a robot, we would engage ministry differently. And we wouldn't be so afraid because we are co-creators, we're collaborators, right? That's like people saying, I'm just gonna wait and ask God to do this. Jesus ain't gonna show up and write a note on your bed. Right? You work with God, right? It's a partnership.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Dr. Ellison.
Follow-up question. So I'm piecing together your process, and there requires a great deal of obedience, listening, exegesis, knowing to discern when to move, when to speak, when to be silent, and following this process, during this process, your psychological, I'm piecing this question together, your psychological, emotional, and spiritual pores open. And so you are vulnerable because you are a clean and clear conduit. I'm curious, after you preach, in that space of vulnerability, how do you care for yourself?
Thank you. I want to say something that wasn't the intent of your question, but it came up, and I will answer your question. Talking about discernment, right? How do you know? I read my sermon last night. I read it this morning. Dr. Williams printed it for me. I ripped out 2 pages of the sermon before I got up. And as I was reading it, I kept going. In the first draft, in the sequence of writing it, yes, it made sense. And I was like, right, because I'm still listening even after I get up there. Because sometimes God says something that wasn't even on the page. So people are like, I have your manuscript. You're not going to find some of the stuff I said in the manuscript. So you're always listening. How do you protect yourself? Right, because you are open, right? You've poured out, you've been obedient. There's an openness, there's a vulnerability. Sometimes, and it's not popular, and I'm not advocating that people do this as people's process. sometimes I don't shake hands depending on, sometimes I'm just like, mm-mm. You just have to discern. I'm like, I'm too open. I'm like, I'm too, sometimes, and preachers can attest to this, you can read the room and you're like, okay, that person is fifth on line. I'm going now. Never heard the last person in line. No, no. And I'm going to, there used to be a time when what I'm about to say would be gendered. It is not anymore. There's a fine line between attraction to spirit and sexual attraction. And that gets confused in the atmosphere. And you have to be real clear. People want to shake your hand a little too long, or people, like, you have to discern. And so my default is not to shake hands. My default is to always have somebody on point watching. I generally try not to go any place and preach by myself as a single woman. And because and whoever goes with me is always reading the room and the people. It's like, okay, it's time for you to go. And you have to get someone you trust, because sometimes they will see things before I do. Because everyone wants to shake the preacher's hand, you want to talk, you want to take pictures, you want to do all of this stuff. And so it depends. Or I don't let everybody hug me. And you just have to discern that in the moment. But there is a distance. And sometimes I just have to come down. Or sometimes I will step out, collect, and come back out and shake hands. Sometimes I can't do it right away, but it depends. So thank you for that question.
Friends, we have time for about 2 more questions.
I just have one question. I'm Antoine. I was
Yes,
up today.
Antoine, thank you so much.
In light of what you just said about having people watching you, do you actively have armor bearers or executive protection in place?
I don't. Oftentimes my cousin will come with me if she's available. Like, I have friends like, we'll go with you. I mean, sometimes I have to go alone just because people's schedules. Some people do. I have lots to say about that. When the camera's off. We can talk about that. Right.
Good stuff.
But I do understand the need for them and appreciate it.
Hi, Dr. Weaver. You mentioned in your sermon, and this also kind of was thematic in yesterday's presentation, about you have to show up with a disposition for worship. What ways would you suggest that in that formative work with congregations, how does that get formed when there's so much trans-denominationalism and people kind of coming with some church experience, no church experience, and just entering without understanding that part of how we show up, there's work that we need to be doing in order to get the most out of worship. So any suggestions that you have as a pastoral leader concerning how pastors might begin to shift the culture or engage congregants in a formative process?
Thank you for the question. And I appreciate the fact that you said, trans-denominationalism, et cetera, and you talk about formation.
Mm-hmm.
I want to split those up, because formation has nothing to do with denominations. Right? Denominations have polity, certain kinds of doctrinal things. The thing that you're talking about is forming disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about forming a holy habitus, is what we talked about yesterday. And you can do that in small moments, right? It doesn't have to be a fleshed out, 9-week curriculum, right? But there's moments that you can take, depending on your liturgy, everybody has to discern that, where you just kind of give a snippet of like, okay, we're going to keep a moment of silence because we're going to practice listening for God. So we're going to listen. We're going to have to be silent before I start praying, right? You begin to tutor people in a habitus of listening. It doesn't take long, right? And so you think of these small ways. Particularly, there was someone yesterday who talked about strictures and things that are licit and illicit in a particular tradition in terms of what they can do in worship. And so you take the spaces that you can, and then you partner with other people in your ministry. And, it depends on what your needs are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I lied. We may have time for one more if someone has a burning question. Okay, so I have the final question.
Okay, Dean Williams.
So, thinking about your lecture on yesterday and your sermon today, and even the collective conversation that we have had, if there is one thing that you want to send us out with as it relates to our engagement over the last 2 days, what is the one thing you want to make sure we walk away with?
Right, that's hard. Using the theme of the conference as an anchor for the answer, I think I would want everyone to remember that we are called, spiritual metaphor, musical metaphor perhaps, to be the musicians in God's orchestra. Right, because God is the conductor of the symphony. The Spirit ultimately has reign in the place. But it is our responsibility to study, to sing, to rehearse, to do all the things and show up. But that the symphony itself belongs to God. And we are privileged musicians in service to the song. I think that's it.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Please
you,
join
Dean
me in
Williams.
thanking Dr. Weaver for her time and for this wonderful conversation. Thank you. Friends, we appreciate you sticking around and being in conversation with us. We do have some lunches for those who are heading out. I do ask, we have a couple of students in the room, so students, please, I ask that we would allow the students to grab lunch first, and then we will have, there are enough lunches, I think, for everyone in the room, but please do grab lunches on your way out if you so desire. Thank you all so much, and before we leave, Dean Fry-Brown, did you want to say any closing remarks whatsoever? It has been a wonderful conference, and so we thank you for your time, your energy, your vision, and the way that you have brought it all together. Go in peace, friends. We will see you later.